Good evening. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed corridors of human psychology, where the brightest lights are not always celebrated but often hunted. You probably wouldn't survive this. That sounds dramatic. I know, but it's closer to the truth than most people dare admit. Some of us walk through life with lanterns we didn't even know we carried, glowing softly, illuminating the corners where others struggle to see. And here's the unsettling part: those lights attract attention. Not the kind of attention you'd wish for. Not admiration or gratitude, but something more predatory. The kind of gaze that doesn't simply see you, but calculates what it can take. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I find it fascinating to imagine this conversation stretching across time zones, whispered in the quiet corners of midnight bedrooms and coffee-scented early mornings. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. I've always felt the room before I saw it, the tension hanging like mist in the air, the way a conversation pauses a beat too long, the tilt of a smile that doesn't reach the eyes. My friends used to laugh about it, calling me a human barometer for emotions. But as the years passed, I began to notice something stranger. The people who gravitated toward me weren't always the cheerful or the steady. More often, they were the ones who carried storms inside them, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Those storms always seemed to want to break open in my presence. At first, it felt like an honor. I was the confidant, the all-in-all-way, the one who understood. People would tell me secrets they hadn't whispered to anyone else. But after enough nights of listening until dawn, of carrying other people's grief like it was my own, I started to realize something chilling. My light was being fed upon, not by vampires and cloaks, though that might have been easier to spot, but by perfectly ordinary people whose hunger was disguised as connection. Carl Jung once suggested that empaths weren't merely unlucky in attracting difficult people, but that something deeper was happening, a gravitational pull of sorts. The empath shines brightly because their nervous system has been trained, sharpened through childhood chaos, to detect and respond to every flicker of emotion. But predators, yes, I'll call them that, though most act unconsciously, see this brightness as survival fuel. To them, it's not cruelty, it's instinct. They don't even know they're feeding. And yet, the effect is the same. I remember one particular evening when I walked into a gathering. The room was buzzing with polite chatter, glasses clinking, laughter bubbling over shallow anecdotes. And then I felt it, eyes on me, not admiring, not flirtatious, but searching. A man drifted over, his smile warm, his voice low. Within minutes, he was telling me about his heartbreak, his struggles, his relentless loneliness. I hadn't offered anything more than a nod and a gentle "I understand," but suddenly I was swimming in his pain. And while he seemed lighter, almost relieved, I left that party with my chest heavy and my head clouded. It was as though I'd been carrying him on my shoulders the entire night. This is what I mean by hidden hunters. They're not necessarily malicious in the way villains are written in novels. More often, they're wounded themselves, stumbling through life trying to borrow what they can't generate within. But here's where the danger lies. Empaths, people like me, people like perhaps you, mistake this extraction for intimacy. We confuse their hunger for our company as evidence of deep connection. We see their reliance as proof of love. Meanwhile, our reserves dwindle, quietly, invisibly. There's a quirky fact about moths. By the way, scientists once believed that moths were drawn to light sources because they mistook them for the moon, a celestial compass for navigation. But later studies suggested something stranger, that artificial light disorients their natural flight paths, leaving them circling endlessly, trapped in confusion. Empaths, I think, are a little like those moths. We believe our brightness is guiding us to connection, when in fact it's often leading us into spirals with people who can't navigate without consuming our glow. And I've noticed something else, something I'll admit feels like old age wisdom creeping in before my time. People who are truly steady, who can generate their own light, rarely demand yours. They appreciate it, yes, but they don't cling to it. They stand beside you, not beneath you. It took me decades to learn that distinction. And even now, I sometimes forget But every time I ignore the lesson, the universe has a way of reminding me with exhaustion, with tension, with the slow sinking sense that I've become someone else's battery pack. It's worth debating. Of course, whether all this talk of energy feeding is merely poetic metaphor or grounded in some psychological reality. Some academics argue that empathy itself can't be exploited in this way, that what we're really describing is poor boundary management. And perhaps they're right in part. But I'd counter that boundaries are exactly what predators test, exactly what they erode. And if you've ever left a conversation feeling inexplicably hollow, like your joy has been siphoned out of you, then you already know it's more than just metaphor. Hidden hunters exist. They may be friends, lovers, colleagues, even family. They move through the world charming, wounded, magnetic. They don't announce their hunger, they display their pain. And if you're not careful, if you don't learn to recognize the shimmer of danger behind their stories, you'll find yourself pouring light into a bottomless well. And one day, you'll look around and realize you have none left for yourself. And so, tonight, as we drift further into Jung's shadowed insights, I'll keep pulling at these threads, not to make you fearful, but to help you see what has always been hidden in plain sight. Because the truth is simple yet haunting. Empaths are not just attracting difficult people, they're being hunted, and most of them never even know it's happening until it's too late. I used to wonder why I could sense a storm in someone else before they even opened their mouth. The twitch of an eyelid, the stiffness in shoulders. Even the way a person exhaled could send a message into my nervous system like a secret code. Over the years, I realized this sensitivity wasn't some supernatural gift handed down by benevolent forces. It was carved into me, slowly and painfully. In childhood, when I was young, the air in my home was never still. There was always something brewing beneath the surface, like an earthquake humming just below ground. My parents rarely raised their voices, but silence had a sharper edge. A slammed door could feel louder than thunder. As a child, I trained myself to anticipate these shifts. If I could read the atmosphere, maybe I could keep things calm. Maybe I could stop an explosion before it came. That's how empathy was planted in me, not as a luxury, but as a survival tactic. Children who grow up in unstable environments become experts at tuning in. It's like living with emotional night vision goggles. You can see things others miss. And when you carry that into adulthood, people notice. They marvel at your intuition. They lean on your compassion. They tell you that you just get them. What they don't see is the hidden cost, that your nervous system is permanently on high alert. Scanning, absorbing, predicting. It's a gift that was born in the dark. And sometimes it still feels like it belongs to the dark. I recall once at university, a friend broke down in front of me after a minor rejection from someone she fancied, while others might have laughed it off or offered shallow sympathy. I felt her pain shoot through me as if it were my own heartbreak. My chest tightened. My hands shook. I nearly cried with her. Later she thanked me, said she'd never felt so understood. What she didn't know was that I spent the next 3 days exhausted, almost ill, like I'd caught her sadness as though it were a cold. That's the strange thing about being highly empathic. You rarely walk away unscathed. Jung once observed that the psyche compensates for trauma by forming adaptations that serve us until they begin to suffocate us. Empathy, in that sense, is a double-edged sword. It allows us to survive chaos, but it also chains us to patterns where we can't help but merge with others' suffering. It's almost laughable. Really, the very thing that saved me as a child, reading the room, softening the blow, carrying what wasn't mine, became the very thing that endangered me as an adult. Survival turned into self-erasure. Here's a quirky fact that always makes me smile bitterly. Did you know that trees communicate through underground fungal networks, warning each other of threats, sharing nutrients, even nurturing weaker saplings? Scientists call it the wood wide web. Nature, it seems, created empathy long before humans thought to name it. But here's the catch. Even trees set limits. They do not endlessly feed parasitic plants, they cut them off. Humans, however, especially empaths, often fail to do the same. We keep giving, convinced it's noble, even when it's killing us slowly. There's an old saying, one I used to roll my eyes at: what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Now that I'm older, I'd amend it slightly. What doesn't kill you reshapes you. And sometimes, that reshaping is painful, even disfiguring. Childhood scars may not be visible, but they contour our personalities, our choices, our loves. They sculpt us into empaths, but they also tether us to a constant vigilance we can't switch off. The wisdom I've scraped together is this: your sensitivity is not a curse, but neither is it a free pass to martyrdom. It needs boundaries, like a river needs banks, or else it will flood everything in its path. Some academics argue that trauma doesn't create empaths at all, that it merely amplifies traits already there. They'll say sensitivity is genetic, not learned, and perhaps they're partly right. But when I compare myself to those who grew up in calm, steady homes, I see a difference. They may be kind, yes, but they don't carry that radar-like intensity. They don't feel responsible for every mood in the room. So I hold fast to my view. Trauma shapes empathy into something sharper, heavier, and more dangerous than mere kindness. Sometimes I imagine my younger self sitting in her room, listening for the tone of footsteps in the hall. She believed she was powerless, that she could only tiptoe through the moods of others. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her she was learning something extraordinary, but that she mustn't forget her own needs in the process. Wisdom isn't born in safety, it is carved in fire. But fire must eventually be tamed, or it consumes the one who carries it. So yes, my empathy was shaped by childhood scars. It grew in the soil of fear, watered by silence, trimmed by the sharp edges of unpredictability. And though I once thought it was a blessing pure and simple, I know better now. It is a blood, gleaming, double-sided. It can cut through walls, but it can also cut into me. The trick, the lifelong journey, is learning when to sheath it. It always starts so quietly, so invisibly, that you almost think you've imagined it. A smile that lingers a beat too long, a sigh that feels heavier than the air around it, a casual remark that leaves you oddly drained. That's the thing about energy parasites. They don't announce themselves like villains in films. They don't cackle or twirl mustaches. They slip in under the radar, feeding little by little, until you realize too late that you've been bled dry. I remember the first time I noticed this phenomenon in my own life. I had a colleague who seemed perpetually troubled, always hovering at the edge of crisis. At first, I leaned in, as I always do. I offered listening ears, late-night chats, endless reassurance. It felt good to help. It gave me purpose. But slowly, I began to notice the pattern. Every interaction left me fatigued, as though I'd run a marathon in my mind. She, however, seemed refreshed, lighter, almost energized. That was my first lesson. What feeds one can deplete another. This invisible feeding is not malicious in the conscious sense. Often the people who drain us don't even know they're doing it. They simply instinctively attach themselves to those who offer bottomless wells of attention, care, and validation. Empaths like me are perfect targets. We are walking buffets of energy, open 24 hours. No reservation required. And because we think our worth comes from helping, we keep the doors wide open. There's an academic term I once stumbled upon that makes me laugh in a dry, ironic way. Psychic vampirism. Sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Like something you'd find in a supernatural novel. But the expression fits. Just as a vampire survives by drinking blood, certain personalities survive by drawing energy from others. The debate, of course, lies in whether this is a conscious exploitation or an unconscious survival strategy. I lean toward the latter. Most parasites don't wake up in the morning and plan, "Today I will drain Sarah dry." It's instinctual. Still, instinct or not, the effect is the same. The empath shrinks while the other grows. Here's a quirky little fact. In nature, there's a type of bird called the common cuckoo that lays its eggs in other birds' nests. The unsuspecting host raises the chick, feeding it tirelessly. Even as it grows larger than the host itself, the host's own chicks often starve as a result. It's a brutal metaphor, but it captures this hidden feeding dynamic perfectly. Some people are cuckoos. They slip their needs into our nest, and we sacrifice ourselves without even realizing it. The old age wisdom I've gathered is this: not every cry for help is meant to be answered. It's a hard lesson for someone like me, because saying no feels cruel, almost like betrayal. But the truth is, boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. They tell the world, I will love you, but I will not let you feed on me. It's an act of self-preservation that also teaches others to find their own strength. One of the most unsettling aspects of this invisible feeding is that it can happen in the most ordinary, mundane conversations. You sit down for coffee, exchange pleasantries, and leave wondering why you feel like you've been wrung out like a dishcloth. At first, you blame yourself. Maybe you didn't sleep well. Maybe you're just stressed. But then the pattern emerges. Every encounter with the same person leaves you weaker, while they seem inexplicably lighter. That's when you know. That's when the parasite has found its source. And yet, part of me still struggles with guilt. Shouldn't I give if I can? Isn't that what being empathic is all about? Here's where I've had to challenge my own conditioning. Empathy is not about endless giving. It's about connection. True connection is reciprocal. It nourishes both sides. If one person always leaves full and the other always leaves empty, that's not connection, it's consumption. I once read an academic argument suggesting that empathic burnout is not caused by giving too much, but by giving without boundaries. I debated this in my head for weeks, and ultimately, I agreed. Boundaries don't stop empathy, they shape it. Without them, empathy turns toxic, becoming the very thing that hollows us out. With them, empathy becomes sustainable, a gift that keeps on giving without draining the giver. So yes, the feeding begins subtly, almost invisibly. It sneaks in through smiles, stories, sorrows. It hides in conversations, in hugs, even in silence, and before you know it, you're tired, disoriented, wondering why your spark feels dimmer. That's the invisible cost of being open-hearted. You must learn to notice who is replenishing your flame and who is quietly snuffing it out. There's a peculiar moment that always stands out in my memory, almost like the turning of a tide. It happens when the giving stops being voluntary and begins to feel compulsory. That is the unspoken contract, the silent agreement that you never signed but somehow keep upholding. At first, you tell yourself you're being generous, compassionate, a good friend, but then you notice how quickly the expectation settles in, how fast kindness becomes duty. It is as though your empathy has been mortgaged, and the repayment is endless. I learned this the hard way in my 20s. I had a close friend, let's call him Daniel, who seemed to live in perpetual crisis. His job was never stable, his relationships always on the brink, his health mysteriously fragile. Naturally, I became his sounding board, his emergency contact, his unpaid therapist, and at first, it felt rewarding to be needed. But slowly, I noticed a shift. If I didn't answer the phone within 3 rings, I'd get a follow-up message laced with guilt. If I dared to suggest that I couldn't meet up because I was tired, he'd remind me of all the times he had no one else. That's when I realized I was living under a contract I had never consciously agreed to. Somewhere along the line, my empathy had been drafted into service. It's astonishing how people will write the terms of such contracts in invisible ink, and you only notice them when you try to pull away. Academically, this dynamic is sometimes framed as emotional labor. It's the expectation that one person will consistently manage, absorb, and regulate another's emotions. The debate, of course, is whether emotional labor should be considered an ethical obligation or a personal choice. Personally, I fall on the side of choice. Obligations that come without consent aren't noble, they're manipulative. Here's a quirky fact that ties in perfectly. Did you know octopuses are escape artists of the animal kingdom? In aquariums, they've been known to slip out of their tanks, slither across floors, and raid neighboring tanks for food before sneaking back as if nothing happened. They bend rules and redefine boundaries in ways keepers don't always notice. That, to me, is what these unspoken contracts feel like. They slip into your life unnoticed, bending your boundaries while you tell yourself it's just being kind. With age, I've come to see this through a gentler lens. Older wisdom whispers that people will take only what you allow. It isn't necessarily cruelty, it's human nature. If you offer without limit, many will accept without question. The lesson isn't to become hard or closed, but to become conscious. To notice the lines you've allowed others to cross and to redraw them when they no longer serve you. The real trap of the unspoken contract is the guilt it breeds. You convince yourself that to say no is to abandon, to reject, even to betray. I can't tell you how many sleepless nights I've spent rehearsing apologies for boundaries I never should have had to justify. Why does it feel so criminal to protect your own energy? Perhaps because, as empaths, we've been conditioned to equate love with self-sacrifice. I once asked myself if I signed an actual paper contract that said, "You will be available at all hours. You will prioritize my needs above your own. You will neglect your health. And in return, you will occasionally receive crumbs of gratitude." Would I sign it? Of course not. But when the terms are written in guilt, affection, and silence, somehow we agree. That's the trap. The transformation begins when you start to question the terms. When you pause mid-conversation and ask yourself, am I here because I want to be, or because I feel obligated? That tiny flicker of awareness is revolutionary. It's like finding the eraser for invisible ink. Suddenly, the unspoken contract is visible, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And here's the twist. When you stop fulfilling the contract, you realize how fragile it really is. The moment you decline a late-night call, say you're busy, or gently refuse to absorb someone else's crisis, you discover how conditional the relationship may have been all along. That revelation hurts, but it also frees. So, the unspoken contract isn't really about them, it's about us, about how long we are willing to uphold agreements we never made, about how much silence we're willing to endure before we find our voice, and maybe, just maybe, about how ready we are to renegotiate the terms of what love and friendship really mean. There's an almost chilling quality to betrayal when you've spent your life being someone's safe place. It isn't just the act that wounds, it's the realization that you saw it coming. You saw the late-night silences, the sudden shift in tone, the hollow reassurances that never matched the eyes. And yet, you ignored it, convincing yourself that loyalty meant disbelief in your own intuition. Betrayal is less about the knife and more about the fact that you handed them the handle. I remember vividly the moment it happened to me. It wasn't the grand spectacle of a soap opera. No screaming matches or overturned tables. Just a single sentence spoken casually across a dinner table. A truth slipped too easily from lips that had rehearsed lies for months. My partner at the time had betrayed me, not only with another person, but with the systematic dismantling of my trust. The food in front of me went cold as my mind stitched together every red flag I had neatly folded away. Betrayal is a quiet earthquake. You don't notice the damage until the walls are already cracked. What fascinated me, even in my pain, was the strange calm that followed. I had always imagined betrayal would reduce me to tears, screaming, maybe even the kind of dramatic scene you'd find in a film. But instead, I felt a strange clarity. My emotions, usually so turbulent, became eerily still. It was as if my empathy had finally withdrawn its endless supply of excuses and left me with the bare, undeniable truth. Academically, betrayal is often framed through the lens of trust violation. Psychologists debate whether betrayal destroys relationships or merely exposes their hidden fractures. I've always found that framing curious. To me, betrayal doesn't destroy, it reveals how much of yourself you were willing to ignore to preserve someone else's comfort. Here's a quirky fact that captures betrayal beautifully. In medieval times, pigeons were used as reliable messengers, carrying notes across great distances. But every so often, a pigeon would be captured, its message intercepted, and then released with a false reply. Entire strategies collapsed because someone trusted a messenger that had been compromised. That's betrayal. The faith you placed in the carrier of truth becomes the weapon used against you. With age, I've come to see betrayal differently. Younger me thought of it as an ending, a catastrophic rupture that signaled failure. Older me recognizes it as initiation, a painful but necessary entry into deeper self-knowledge. Wisdom whispers that betrayal is not the breaking of your heart, but the breaking of your illusions. It strips away the stories you told yourself about who they were and who you were. 2. When betrayal strikes, the empath's first instinct is self-blame. You run through the catalog of moments you should have spoken up, times you should have acted differently. You imagine that if only you had been more attentive, more patient, more perfect, the betrayal would not have occurred. That's the lie of betrayal. It convinces you that someone else's choices are your responsibility. But then comes what I call the clarity event. That sudden, irreversible recognition that you were never blind. You saw it all. The half-truths, the inconsistencies, the small cruelties masquerading as jokes. You simply chose silence, chose loyalty, chose to keep the peace. And that moment, that awareness, is transformative. It is when the empath stops gaslighting themselves and starts trusting the very perceptions they were taught to doubt. In hindsight, betrayal was the moment my shadow began to surface. Not as rage or bitterness, but as precision. I could suddenly map the entire landscape of the relationship with startling clarity. I could see where trust had been traded for convenience, where love had been confused with dependence, where care had become currency, and in that moment, I wasn't broken. I was awake. The gift of betrayal, if one can call it that, is the end of illusions. You stop pretending that people are what you wish them to be and begin to see them as they are. It's unsettling. Yes, but it is also liberating. Because once you've seen the truth, you can't be manipulated by the lie. And perhaps that's why betrayal terrifies those who cause it. They expect drama, chaos, a flood of tears they can dismiss as weakness. What they never expect is silence, the silence of someone who has finally aligned their perception with reality. That silence is power. It is the birth of a new kind of empath, one who no longer apologizes for seeing too clearly. Calm is a deceptive thing. People often mistake it for weakness, for resignation, for surrender, but the calm that follows betrayal is none of those things. It is surgical, precise, a stillness that comes not from lack of feeling, but from an overwhelming abundance of it, distilled into clarity. When the storm of shock subsides, what remains is a quiet strength that unnerves those who once thrived on your confusion. I recall sitting across from someone who had lied to me for months. They were waiting for me to shout, to collapse, to crumble in a heap of tears. That's what abusers count on. Chaos. Because chaos can be managed, redirected, spun into another excuse. But I didn't give them chaos. I gave them silence. I let my words fall with measured precision, each one a scalpel cutting through years of distortion. Carl Jung wrote of shadow integration as the moment we reclaim the parts of ourselves society has forced us to deny. For me, calm was the manifestation of that reclamation. I wasn't suppressing rage, I was aligning with truths. Every piece of data I had silently collected over the years, every micro-expression, every slip of the tongue, every strange inconsistency suddenly arranged itself into a coherent map. I was no longer stumbling in the dark. I had night vision. The academic world might call this cognitive restructuring, the sudden reorganization of perception after a critical event. Debates still rage about whether it is a sign of resilience or a form of psychological dissociation. Personally, I think it's neither. It's not resilience because resilience implies bouncing back, returning to what was before. And it's not dissociation because you're not disconnected from reality. You're finally, terrifyingly connected to it. It is awareness without apology. Here's a curious fact that always makes me smile. Octopuses, when threatened, will release ink not just to obscure themselves, but to create a decoy shape that looks like their body. Predators chase the false form, while the octopus slips away in silence. Calm after betrayal feels a lot like that. People expect the loud display of hurt, the ink cloud of chaos, but instead, you become invisible in plain sight, conserving your energy for what actually matters. With age, I've learned that calmness is a weapon, not in the way a sword is a weapon, swinging wildly and leaving blood in its wake, but in the way a scalpel is precise, deliberate, irreversible. Calmness makes people reveal themselves. They stumble over explanations that no longer hold water. They fidget in the face of your unwavering gaze. They try to provoke a reaction because your stillness is unbearable to them. I remember the exact moment my calm unnerved someone who thought they held power over me. They leaned across the table, searching for cracks in my composure. "Aren't you even angry?" they asked, their voice trembling with the confusion of someone who had expected tears. I smiled, just slightly, and replied, "Anger would be wasted on you." The look in their eyes, that was the first time I saw fear, not fear of me, but fear of losing control. Here's where wisdom comes in. True calm is not indifference. Indifference is a wall, calm is a mirror. Indifference blocks connection, but calm reflects everything back with merciless clarity. That's why manipulators fear it. They can't twist silence into a weapon because silence doesn't give them material. They can't dismiss composure as hysteria because composure doesn't raise its voice. Calm is the one thing they can't exploit. Of course, calm doesn't arrive immediately. It's earned through fire. It comes after you've wrestled with the gnawing self-doubt, after you've stared into the abyss of betrayal, after you've allowed grief to wash through your bones. Only then does calm settle. not as numbness but as power. It's the wisdom of realizing that rage may burn bright, but calm endures longer. What fascinates me still is how contagious that calm becomes. When you stop responding to manipulation with drama, the entire dynamic shifts. Toxic people retreat because they have nothing left to feed on. Healthy people, on the other hand, are drawn closer. Comforted by your steadiness, your calm becomes a kind of gravity, pulling in those who seek truth and pushing away those who rely on lies. And maybe that's the greatest irony. Calm, which society often labels as passivity, is in truth the loudest form of resistance. It says, without words, I see you, I understand you, and I am no longer moved by you. That's not surrender, it's sovereignty. When the calm finally settled into me, it was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new one. What followed was what I can only describe as an unstoppable reconstruction. The life I had tolerated, the relationships I had endured, the patterns I had accepted, all of it began to unravel, but not with the chaos I once feared. It unraveled with strategy, precision, and a kind of quiet determination that surprised even me. I didn't storm out of people's lives with slammed doors and dramatic declarations. That would have been too easy for them to dismiss as overreaction. Instead, I withdrew like a tide that never returned. Numbers were blocked, conversations ended mid-sentence, and connections that had once consumed me simply fell silent. I was still polite, still composed, but no longer available as an emotional reservoir for anyone else's dysfunction. Carl Jung once noted that transformation after betrayal does not simply heal a wound, it redefines the entire person. I think he was right. The woman who once apologized for her existence no longer lived in my skin. In her place stood someone far more deliberate, someone who no longer confused suffering with love. It wasn't that I became colder. If anything, I grew warmer, but only to those who deserved it. That was the difference. Here's an odd little fact for you. Termites never sleep. They work around the clock, endlessly chewing through wood, slowly dismantling entire structures without anyone noticing until it's too late. Relationships that lack boundaries are a lot like that. They erode silently, bit by bit, until one day you find your foundations hollow. The reconstruction stage is about sealing off the termites and rebuilding the house with stronger wood. From an academic standpoint, this stage might be called self-actualization. The process of aligning life with your authentic self rather than with imposed roles, and yet scholars argue about whether this is a universal stage or simply a privilege for those who have endured enough suffering to break free. Personally, I think suffering is the tuition fee for wisdom. It's expensive, but the education is unmatched. I began rebuilding not with grand gestures but with small acts of sovereignty. Waking up without checking my phone to see who needed me. Cooking meals I enjoyed rather than what others preferred. Saying no without guilt and yes without fear. It sounds simple, but to someone who had lived as a perpetual caretaker, these acts were revolutionary. The most unsettling part for others was how efficient I became. I didn't stumble through leaving toxic relationships. I executed it like a plan I'd rehearsed for years, which in a way I had. Every observation I had collected in silence became the blueprint for my reconstruction. I knew who would try to guilt me, who would attempt to gaslight me, who would play the victim. And I had rehearsed my responses in the privacy of my mind long before they ever spoke the words. One person tried to lure me back with nostalgia, reminding me of the good times. I smiled, nodded, and said, yes, I remember those too. And I remember how they always ended. Another insisted I was abandoning them. My reply was simple. I'm not abandoning you. I'm just refusing to abandon myself anymore. There was no argument after that. Silence is the most satisfying ending to manipulation. Here's the reflection I return to often. Rebuilding is not about constructing walls to keep people out. It's about designing doors that only open inward, for those who knock with respect. Age has taught me that life is too short to hand out keys to people who burn houses down. Of course, not everyone cheered my transformation. Some recoiled as if I had committed a crime. To them, my boundaries were insults. My self-respect was arrogance. My calmness was cruelty. But that was the clearest indicator that I was on the right path. The ones who truly cared adjusted, respected, and even celebrated the changes. They recognized that my reconstruction wasn't about rejecting love. It was about creating space for love that didn't require self-destruction. There is something terrifying about a person who reconstructs their life without apology. They become unpredictable to those who once manipulated them. And predictability is the manipulator's lifeline. The strategy, the composure, the unshakable clarity, it disarms them. They try one trick after another, only to find themselves facing an impenetrable calm. Looking back, I see that the reconstruction wasn't just about leaving people behind. It was about reclaiming the person I was always meant to be, before life convinced me to shrink. And that reclamation was not loud, not vengeful, not cruel. It was simply unstoppable. The more my reconstruction took shape, the clearer it became that what I was experiencing was not collapse, but evolution. I had stepped through some invisible threshold, and on the other side, the world felt entirely different. People who had once towered over me, with their demands and manipulations, now seemed strangely small. Conversations that once left me drained now barely skimmed the surface of my attention. It was as though the rules of engagement had shifted overnight, and I was no longer playing the same game. Carl Jung described this as shadow integration, the union of all the parts of ourselves we had been trained to deny. I understood then what he meant. My shadow wasn't the dark, monstrous thing I had feared for years. It was my intelligence, my clarity, my unapologetic truth. For so long, I had hidden these traits because they unsettled people who preferred me docile. Once integrated, those traits no longer frightened me. They became my tools. Like a carpenter discovering the hammer had always been in his pocket. Here's a quirky fact that came to mind one evening. In Japanese culture, the art of kintsugi involves repairing broken pottery with gold, making the cracks part of the beauty rather than flaws to be hidden. That was me, my betrayals, my collapses, the places where I'd shattered. These became the gilded seams of a self I could finally admire. I wasn't less because I had been broken. I was more because I had been remade. The academic phrase that haunted me during this stage was psychological completeness. It sounds so clinical, almost sterile, but it describes the most visceral of human transformations. To become psychologically complete is not to arrive at perfection. It is to arrive at wholeness, where nothing inside you is exiled or suppressed. Wholeness doesn't ask you to be flawless. It asks you to be honest. And honesty, I discovered, is a terrifying force. Honesty made my presence unsettling for certain people. Those who thrived on deception could no longer breathe comfortably around me. I didn't need to accuse, argue, or attack. My silence was often enough. One manipulative acquaintance once snapped at me, "Why are you looking at me like that?" I hadn't said a word. I'd simply been listening. But in that moment, I realized that integrated empaths don't need to expose people loudly. Their presence alone reflects the truth, like a mirror no one asked to look into. There's an old age wisdom I cling to now. You cannot be both the shield and the sword for everyone else. At some point, you must decide whether to continue carrying other people's battles or to finally fight for yourself. When you choose the latter, it isn't selfishness, it's balance. And balance, I learned, feels like peace. Humor kept me grounded too. I joked once with a friend that I had developed empath Wi-Fi. Walk into a room, and suddenly I had full bars of information about everyone's unspoken emotions. The password, betrayal. The bandwidth, unlimited. We laughed. But underneath the humor was a truth too sharp to ignore. I could read people faster than they could edit their facial expressions. That wasn't mystical. It was simply years of enforced observation put to use. It is both a gift and a burden. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. Lies sound louder. Manipulations move in slow motion. The games people play are written in neon, and once you've awakened, you can't pretend ignorance. That is both the power and the price of shadow integration. What startled me most was how calm the transformation remained. There was no rage, no outburst, no desperate need for revenge. Only a steady unveiling of what had always been there. My empathy didn't die in the process. It became sharper, more precise. Instead of being a flood that drowned me, it became a river that I could channel wherever I chose. And choice, that was the key. For the first time, I chose where my energy flowed, and that choice was liberation. When I look back at that period now, I don't see the monster I feared becoming. I see the person I was always meant to be, finally allowed to breathe. Integration didn't strip away my softness. It gave it boundaries. It didn't extinguish my compassion. It taught me discernment. And that discernment is what turned the once fractured empath into something far more resilient than anyone expected. A human being who could no longer be broken in the same way twice. The further I stepped into this new awareness, the more I noticed how people responded differently to me without me ever needing to announce the change. It was as if some invisible field had shifted. Friends who once took my silence as permission now hesitated before unloading their chaos. Relatives who had confidently dictated my choices suddenly stumbled over their words. Even strangers seemed to sense something unusual, giving me a wider berth in cues or looking twice before speaking. Jung described this phenomenon in his notes, and I finally understood why he had called it the predator's instinct. Manipulative people, like predators, can sense when their prey is no longer prey. What amused me was the nervousness people couldn't quite explain. I wasn't threatening, I didn't raise my voice or cut people down, yet they felt it. My presence carried the weight of someone who could no longer be deceived, and that alone unsettled them. One man at a dinner party once muttered nervously, "You've got those eyes, like you see right through people." I smiled and sipped my drink, secretly amused that he had accidentally given me the best compliment of the evening. It reminded me of a quirky fact I stumbled upon in a book about animal behavior. Wolves can distinguish between strong prey and weak prey simply by observing posture and energy. They rarely waste energy attacking an animal that clearly won't fall easily. That was me now. The wolves in human form could see it in my stance, my tone, my stillness. They sensed instinctively, not worth the attempt. An old saying echoed in my mind often during this stage. When you stop chasing people, you start attracting the right ones. I had heard it before, dismissed it as one of those comforting slogans passed around like sweets, but now it became real. By not bending, shrinking, or apologizing, I created a vacuum where only authentic people could remain. It wasn't about pushing others away, it was about magnetizing a different frequency. The academic expression that clung to me here was selective empathy. Psychologists debate whether empathy is limitless or bounded, whether it is something we can ration without becoming cold. My life became proof that empathy, when channeled selectively, becomes not weaker but stronger. I cared more deeply for fewer people, and in doing so, I discovered a depth of connection I had never known before. Of course, it wasn't without humor. A colleague once asked me why I seemed too calm during an office crisis where everyone else panicked over a minor technical glitch. I shrugged and said, "I've survived worse. Try betrayal. Then we'll talk." He laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. I was only half joking. It is astonishing how little everyday chaos rattles you once you've walked through your personal inferno. It also forced me to rethink what strength looked like. Strength wasn't charging into battle at every slight. It wasn't asserting dominance loudly or constantly proving myself. True strength, I realized, was being unbothered. It was watching someone attempt their usual manipulation and feeling only mild boredom instead of outrage. It was the steady confidence of knowing that nothing they said or did could dislodge the foundation I had rebuilt. And yet, the danger in this phase was arrogance. I flirted briefly with the intoxicating feeling of invulnerability, the sense that, because I could see through others, I was somehow untouchable. But wisdom reminded me of balance. No matter how perceptive I had become, I was still human, still capable of error. The mirror I carried reflected others truthfully, but I also had to ensure it reflected myself. Self-deception, I realized, was still the greatest threat. I laughed one evening as I thought about how much energy I had once spent trying to be liked. I had been like a salesman desperately pitching a product nobody asked for, running promotional offers of myself just to earn scraps of validation. Now, I offered nothing beyond authenticity. And ironically, people valued me more. There's a cruel humor in that. Stop trying and suddenly you're the most sought-after guest. I also noticed how predators avoided me. Manipulative acquaintances vanished from my life as if by instinct, some without explanation, others with dramatic flares of resentment. At first, I wondered if I had done something wrong. But then I remembered Jung's words. The integrated empath is like sunlight to those who thrive in shadows. They simply cannot remain in the same space. And their departure wasn't rejection, it was liberation. In the quiet that followed, I experienced something I had never felt before. Spaciousness. My mind, once filled with constant calculations of other people's moods, had room for creativity, rest, and joy. The silence wasn't empty, it was alive. I wrote more, walked longer, laughed louder, my sensitivity, once my burden, had become my companion. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this stage was that power doesn't need performance. It simply exists. A candle doesn't apologize for its flame, nor does it demand attention. It just burns. And the room responds. That was me. Finally, after years of apologizing for existing, the moment I began to draw firm lines in the sand, I quickly learned that boundaries are not received as politely as self-help books sometimes promise. It was as if the very air shifted when I first uttered the word no with conviction. Those who had once relied on my endless availability suddenly looked at me as though I had grown horns. The escalation was almost immediate, as if I had insulted some hidden covenant they believed I had signed. It reminded me of something my grandmother once said with a mischievous grin. When you stop pouring tea, the guests will start rattling their cups louder. She was right. People rattled, stomped, sometimes even shouted when I stopped refilling their emptiness. The more I tried to steady myself, the more dramatic the performances became. Tears, accusations, cold silences, sudden illnesses, each one a desperate attempt to tug me back into my old role as emotional caretaker. I even remember one particularly comical moment when a friend texted me a lengthy paragraph declaring, "You've changed. You're selfish now." I replied with only 3 words. Yes, thank you. They didn't respond. Perhaps sarcasm isn't always the most therapeutic tool, but it did wonders for my sanity that day. The academics would call this phenomenon reactive control escalation. Essentially, when you pull away from manipulative dynamics, the other party often amplifies their tactics, hoping to regain equilibrium. To me, it felt like wrestling a toddler who throws a tantrum when their favorite toy is taken away. The louder the tantrum, the clearer the confirmation I was doing something right, but the intensity of these reactions tested me. Some nights, I lay awake questioning if I had gone too far. If maybe kindness meant tolerating the discomfort of others forever, it was a dangerous temptation. Because guilt is the leash manipulators depend on. If they can make you feel like a villain for simply resting, they'll never need to become self-sufficient. In those nights, old age wisdom guided me, a reflection that to truly care for others, you cannot be their oxygen tank. My body, too, whispered the truth. Headaches eased. My breath felt deeper. Even my dreams grew calmer, no longer haunted by endless rescues. My physiology knew before my mind fully accepted that I was walking the right path. One quirky fact that amused me was something I stumbled across in a psychology article. Apparently, jellyfish have no brains yet manage to navigate oceans. I used to joke with myself, if jellyfish can float through life without a brain, surely I can glide through one evening without rescuing anyone. It helped me laugh when the heaviness of others' demands threatened to pull me back under. Not everyone resisted my changes. A few surprising voices quietly encouraged me, saying they admired the courage it took to set boundaries. One person confessed that they had long wanted to say no in their own life but had never dared, and my example gave them permission. That was when I realized my boundaries were not just walls, they were signals. They declared, "This is how a free person lives," and freedom, once seen, cannot easily be unseen. Still, the escalation phase was not without scars. Some relationships collapsed entirely. Others dragged through awkward stalemates before fading into silence. Each departure stung like a small cut, but collectively, they cleansed me. The spaces left behind began to fill with quieter, truer connections. It was like pruning a tree, painful in the moment, but the only way for healthier branches to grow. What astonished me most was how predictable the manipulations became. They all fell into patterns. The sudden victim act, the guilt-soaked speeches, the rage-filled silence. Once I recognized the patterns, I could almost predict the lines before they were spoken. It reminded me of watching a play for the second time. You already know when the villain will make their entrance, so you stop jumping in surprise. In the end, escalation wasn't a sign of failure, but of progress. It showed me who thrived only when I was small. It revealed how fragile certain connections were, built not on love but on my compliance. And it taught me the paradox of boundaries. The more resistance you face at first, the more peace you gain later. And perhaps that was the joke life played on me. For years, I had believed saying no would cause my world to collapse. In truth, it collapsed only where it needed to. and what remained was sturdier than I could have ever imagined. The strangest shift came after the escalation subsided. For a while, I thought people would eventually accept my boundaries, and life would simply return to a calmer version of normal. What I didn't anticipate was the quiet, ripple effect that followed me everywhere. I started to notice it in people's eyes, the way conversations faltered when I stayed silent, the hesitation before someone asked me for something unreasonable, the way laughter sometimes carried a nervous edge. It was as though my presence had altered without my doing anything. I hadn't grown taller, stronger, or louder, but people acted as though I had. Even simple interactions felt loaded. Like others, sensed some invisible current running through me. I remembered Jung's phrase, "Predators avoid sunlight," and thought, perhaps this is what he meant. It wasn't that I became dangerous, it was that I was no longer available as prey. A quirky fact crossed my mind one afternoon as I sat in a cafe, watching people glance at me and then quickly look away. Did you know that cats can detect earthquakes before they happen, often fleeing an area hours before the tremors? That's what people seem to be doing, reacting instinctively, as if their inner compass warned them that I was no longer safe for exploitation. I wasn't a quake, but I was a shift, and shifts make people uneasy. Of course, I tested this theory. During one dinner party, I deliberately said nothing while a friend described their latest drama. In the past, I would have leapt in with sympathetic nods and offers of help. This time, I simply listened. The silence stretched long enough that they began nervously justifying their own story, as if the absence of my usual cushioning made the cracks in their tale obvious even to themselves. That night, I realized silence can be more powerful than advice, and sometimes more terrifying too. What troubled me slightly was the way manipulators started retreating on their own. They didn't confront me anymore, they simply disappeared. At first, I wondered if I had become too harsh, too cold, but then I remembered an old proverb. When the lamp burns steadily, moths stop circling. My steadiness was not cruelty, it was clarity. And clarity, I learned, is uncomfortable for those who thrive in confusion. Academics might label this phenomenon nonverbal boundary signaling. That's the polite way of saying people can smell confidence the way dogs smell fear. And just as dogs will bark less when they sense no fear to exploit. People who once drained me now found themselves oddly tongue-tied. I had to laugh at how quickly the roles reversed. Where once I walked into a room feeling like the smallest presence, now others seemed cautious, even deferential. I joked to myself that I must have developed some kind of Jedi aura. These are not the emotional resources you're looking for, I would think, chuckling quietly as I refused another unnecessary favor. But beneath the humor was something deeper, a strange kind of solitude. Power, even the quiet kind, can be isolating. I missed the simplicity of being overlooked. Even as I celebrated the liberation of being untouchable, it was a bittersweet trade. Yet wisdom reminded me, it is better to walk alone with dignity than in a crowd without it. And dignity, I had finally discovered, was worth the solitude. Over time, the nervousness of others began to feel less like rejection and more like respect. Those who stayed did so with honesty, and those who left gave me space to grow. I no longer chased validation, because I finally grasped what Jung meant about integration. When you merge what was once hidden with what was always visible, people see you differently, whether you announce it or not. The ripple effect wasn't about intimidation. It was about presence. I had become a mirror, reflecting back the truth of every interaction. For some, that truth was too much. For others, it was an invitation to step into honesty themselves. And so my world quietly restructured around me, leaving behind the echoes of who I used to be. The ripple effect reached a new depth when I started to observe how my transformation was not contained within me. It spread through every relationship, every family dinner, every casual conversation. I hadn't declared war, yet the systems I was part of began to collapse or reinvent themselves, depending on whether they thrived on dysfunction or honesty. Take my family, for instance. For years, I had been the one smoothing things over, the shock absorber, the silent listener who patched together fragile egos with polite nods and endless patience. When I stopped cushioning, arguments that had long been muffled erupted into the open. A sibling once accused me of being different, distant, too cold. But what they were really saying was, "You're no longer absorbing my chaos." It was not cruelty that had changed me, it was refusal. I noticed something remarkable. When I removed myself from being the buffer, people had only two options: evolve or reveal themselves. Some did evolve. A cousin began therapy for the first time, perhaps realizing there was no longer an endless well of emotional labor waiting at the family table. Others, however, grew louder, more erratic, trying to drag me back into old roles. But once you've tasted freedom, no plea is strong enough to bind you again. This is what I call the empath's mirror effect. I didn't have to accuse, confront, or condemn anyone. My presence alone, steady and unapologetic, acted as a mirror that reflected their unresolved truths. And here's the uncomfortable part: most people don't like mirrors. They prefer dim corners where flaws are hidden. But when you stand still in your clarity, you shine a light whether you mean to or not. An amusing aside here: did you know that in old theaters, mirrors were considered bad luck backstage? Actors avoided them, fearing they'd reveal weaknesses in their performance. I think life is not so different. Most people would rather avoid a mirror than face their unpolished selves. And yet, in standing firm, I became that unavoidable mirror. Academics might frame this as systemic destabilization, when a keystone role within a network changes, forcing others to adapt or collapse. That's a clinical way of describing the messiness of human drama. In simpler terms, I had stopped being the rug under which everything was swept. Naturally, the dust began to choke those who had depended on me to keep it hidden. Still, wisdom whispered that sometimes things must fall apart to reveal what should never have been held together in the first place. It reminded me of an old gardener's advice: you cannot prune without a mess on the ground. And my pruning, though quiet, was radical. Relationships that were built on my compliance cracked, while those rooted in honesty deepened with surprising strength. One evening, a friend said to me, half in awe, half in irritation, "You've become impossible to manipulate." I laughed and replied, "That's the nicest insult I've ever received." It wasn't that I had grown hard-hearted. I still cared deeply, but my care now came with borders. Like a river contained within strong banks, the water flowed, but it no longer flooded indiscriminately. The oddest part was how genuine people seemed drawn closer, as if they could finally breathe in my presence. One described it as feeling safe to be authentic, while another admitted they used to censor themselves around me, fearing judgment. I realized that my transformation wasn't just about shedding toxicity. It was about cultivating spaces where truth could exist without fear. In time, I understood that my shift was not destruction but revelation. Those who clung to dysfunction revealed it more blatantly. Those who longed for honesty stepped into it more freely. My role had never been to carry others' burdens endlessly. My role was to reflect, to witness, to stand as proof that you can endure betrayal and emerge not bitter, but sovereign. That sovereignty, I found, was contagious. One by one, the healthier people around me began drawing their own boundaries. They stopped apologizing unnecessarily, stopped offering explanations to those who never deserved them. It was like watching candles being lit from a single flame, each one steadying the room against the shadows. Looking back, I see that this ripple effect was inevitable. You cannot change without your environment reacting, just as you cannot drop a stone in a pond without creating waves. What matters most is whether you remain calm in the ripples, refusing to apologize for the clarity you now carry. And though some relationships dissolved, those that endured became lighter, freer, and infinitely more real. As the ripples spread further outward, I began to notice something uncanny in my interactions with strangers. It was as if my transformation had altered the frequency I emitted, and people, without knowing why, reacted to it instinctively. Those who relied on subtle manipulation, the sly flattery, the half-truths, the carefully orchestrated guilt trips, found their tricks landing flat, like an actor forgetting their lines on stage. Others, the more genuine souls, seemed drawn to me, curious, almost relieved, as if they had finally stumbled into a space where masks weren't required. There was one incident in particular that crystallized this realization. I was seated in a cafe, sipping coffee that tasted more like burnt nostalgia than actual beans, when a stranger struck up a conversation. Within 5 minutes, without me prompting, they confessed details about their life they claimed they had never shared with anyone. They spoke of betrayals, regrets, and long-buried dreams. I didn't interrupt. I didn't offer advice. I simply listened. And when they paused, I gently said, "You already know what you need to do." Their eyes widened, not in offense but in recognition. They later said it felt as if I had seen straight through the armor they had spent years polishing. This was when I understood what Jung himself feared and marveled at in equal measure. Integrated empaths develop a diagnostic clarity that rivals decades of training. It wasn't that I had suddenly become a mind reader. It was that I had stopped doubting my observations. Micro expressions, subtle shifts in tone, tiny inconsistencies in stories, all of it registered in me like notes on a score, and I could read the music effortlessly. Quirky fact. Did you know that poker players often wear sunglasses not just to hide their eyes, but to conceal micro expressions? Turns out the face leaks more data than any spreadsheet. And once you stop second guessing yourself, it's like you've been upgraded with the best lie detector money could never buy. Now, of course, this kind of ability is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allowed me to protect myself in ways I never had before. Gaslighting became impossible because I trusted my perceptions more than anyone else's reassurances. On the other hand, it presented an ethical dilemma that haunted me quietly. If I could see through people this easily, wasn't there a temptation to use it, to exploit it? I caught myself pondering that very question late at night, like some kind of philosophical midnight snack. Academic circles might describe this tension as the ethical integration paradox, when enhanced psychological clarity creates the possibility of manipulation alongside healing. But I chose to think of it more simply, like owning a sharp knife. You can prepare nourishing meals with it, or you can wound. The knife itself is neutral. It is the hand holding it that decides its fate. Here's where old age wisdom offered me comfort. An elderly neighbor once told me, "The real test of strength isn't in what you can do, but in what you choose not to do." I carried that with me like a talisman. Yes, I could slice through people's pretenses with surgical precision, but the greater power lay in restraint, in choosing when to act, when to remain silent, and when to let people wrestle with their own shadows. I began to see how this restraint itself became unsettling to others. Those who tried their old tactics found themselves suddenly exposed, as if their invisible cloak had slipped. They often grew agitated, restless, or avoided me entirely. Manipulators, I realized, have a predator's instinct. They can sense when their prey has grown teeth. It's not about confrontation, it's about presence. You don't need to announce your clarity, it radiates. Oddly enough, I found humor in this. Once, someone attempted a clumsy guilt trip, and I responded with a straight face. "Sorry, my manipulation filter's been upgraded. You'll need a newer version." They laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke. But I wasn't entirely joking. 3 witty quips a day. I told myself it keeps the manipulators away. But humor aside, I also found myself in awe of how my transformation began to inspire others. Friends told me they felt braver setting boundaries after watching me do so unapologetically. A colleague confided that my quiet refusal to engage in office politics gave them permission to step back too. I wasn't trying to be a role model. But perhaps that's how influence works. It happens not when you demand attention, but when you embody change. And so, as I walked through this new chapter, I found that my presence carried both comfort and discomfort, depending on who stood before me. Some saw in me a safe harbor. Others saw a lighthouse that illuminated their deceptions too brightly. Either way, the effect was undeniable. I had become, quite unintentionally, both a mirror and a catalyst, and that, I realized, was the true essence of awakening. By the time I reached this stage, the change felt less like a conscious effort and more like a natural state of being. What began as a shaky, deliberate practice of saying no, of holding silence, of staring back at shadows without flinching, had crystallized into something instinctual. I didn't have to remind myself to hold boundaries anymore. They were simply there, like the skin on my body, invisible but undeniable. One evening, I stood in front of a mirror and realized that the person looking back wasn't just older, wiser, or more self-assured. They were whole, not perfect, not without flaws, but whole, in a way that didn't require constant explanation or defense. For the first time, I felt that elusive balance between sensitivity and strength, compassion and clarity. Jung had written that wholeness, not happiness, is the true aim of life, and now I understood it. Happiness comes and goes, as fleeting as weather, But wholeness is a climate you can live in. I thought back to the younger version of myself, the one who had tiptoed around other people's moods as though they were landmines. How much time had I wasted rehearsing apologies I never needed to make? How many years had I spent being proud of my empathy, yet blind to the way it was being siphoned off by those who saw it as a resource to exploit? Old age wisdom whispered in me then, don't grieve the lost years, because they were the tuition for the life you now live. Every lesson is paid for, one way or another. A quirky fact surfaced as I sat with this thought. Apparently, trees can graft their roots together underground, sharing water and nutrients across species. In some forests, a dying tree is kept alive for decades by its neighbors. That's empathy in its purest form. But here's the difference. Trees don't give so much that they collapse. They share within the limits of what keeps the whole forest alive. Humans, on the other hand, often forget those limits. My earlier life had been a warning tale of a tree draining itself dry to keep others blooming. Now, I realized the wisdom lay in balance. The academic term that hovered over me was individuation, the process Jung described as integrating the conscious and unconscious to achieve self-realization. But honestly, it felt less like a lofty philosophical process and more like a sigh of relief. I didn't need to deny my empathy, nor did I need to weaponize my shadow. Both had a seat at the table, and together they made me less fragile, less naive, and far more at peace. The real gift of this wholeness was freedom. Freedom from the endless self-questioning. Freedom from needing to be liked. Freedom from the subtle manipulations that once hooked me. I joked to myself that if someone handed me a survey titled, "How easily manipulated are you?" I could now confidently tick less than average. It was a silly thought, but it made me smile in a way only someone who has lived on both sides of that spectrum could understand. And yet, freedom wasn't the loud, cinematic triumph I once imagined. It was quieter, like a soft chair after a long day, or the steady rhythm of breathing when you finally fall asleep. It wasn't about conquering or winning. It was about resting into who I already was, minus the excess baggage. The greatest insight, perhaps, was this: being whole doesn't make life easier, it makes it clearer. You still face challenges, misunderstandings, and losses, but you face them with both feet planted firmly, instead of tottering on the shifting sands of other people's approval. And clarity, I realized, is often better than ease. So there I stood, not at the end of some heroic saga, but at the beginning of a simpler, steadier existence. I had stitched together the torn fabric of empathy and shadow, and the garment fit better than I ever imagined. It wasn't flawless, but it was mine. And that, I thought, was worth everything. The final turn in this journey wasn't marked by fireworks or grand revelations, but by a profound stillness that crept into my everyday life. I noticed it first in conversations that once would have drained me, where I used to overanalyze every pause, every sigh, every flicker of disapproval. I now listened with a kind of detached curiosity. People's words carried weight, yes, but they no longer landed like blows. I could hear them, respond thoughtfully, and then let them drift away without attaching hooks to my ribs. That, I realized, was the kind of liberation most empaths secretly crave, the ability to care deeply without bleeding for it. It struck me one morning while walking through a quiet park. The air was damp from rain, and the pigeons pecked lazily at crumbs near a bench. I watched them, remembering how much energy I had once wasted explaining myself to people who were determined not to understand me. The pigeons didn't apologize for pecking too loudly or for occupying space. They simply existed. It made me laugh. Perhaps a little too loudly for that hour, but there was freedom in seeing life that simply is. My laughter startled the birds, but I told them aloud, "Don't worry, I get it now. If anyone had seen me, they'd have thought me eccentric." But maybe that was the point. Authenticity sometimes looks like madness to those still trapped. Old age wisdom murmured again. The test of growth isn't whether others recognize your progress, but whether you feel lighter carrying yourself through the day. I remembered my grandmother saying once, "If you want to know if you're free, check how often you look over your shoulder." I hardly looked back anymore, neither to chase old approvals nor to dodge imagined criticisms. I learned another quirky fact that tied neatly into this new state of being. Did you know that jellyfish have survived for more than 500 million years without a brain? It's oddly comforting. If a brainless creature can float gracefully through the chaos of oceans, maybe I don't need to solve everything with overthinking. Sometimes drifting is part of survival. My younger self, the over-analyst, would have scoffed at that idea. But now, I saw the value in surrender, not as defeat, but as a trust in the current of life. From an academic perspective, what I had arrived at could be framed as the apex of shadow integration. Jung described it as the stage where one lives authentically, guided not by external conditioning, but by inner wholeness. Yet, if you strip away the jargon, it was simply learning to live with myself fully, no longer fragmenting my empathy into guilt or diluting my instincts with self-doubt. I had become what Jung hinted at, not a saint, not a monster, but something more balanced, more untouchable by manipulation, and yet still profoundly human. There was a calm power in this state that others seemed to notice. People who once leaned heavily on my silence found themselves unsettled by my presence, though I never raised my voice. Others, the genuine ones, seemed to relax more deeply around me, as though they could trust me not to play games or betray their openness. I became, unintentionally, a mirror reflecting back what others brought into the space. For some, it was a comfort. For others, a discomfort they could not bear. I didn't need to manage their reactions anymore. That was their work, not mine. If you've ever stood at the edge of the sea on a calm day, you'll know the feeling. The waves move endlessly, yet there is no panic in them, no urgency. That was how life began to feel, motion without chaos, depth without drowning. And so, in this final stretch, I found myself circling back to the beginning, to the empath who once thought they were broken for feeling too much. How strange that the very thing I believed to be my flaw was, in truth, the foundation of my strength. It was never about being less sensitive. It was about learning to sense without surrendering myself. That was the awakening Jung hinted at. That was the life I had stumbled, clawed, and finally walked into with both eyes open. I no longer worried about snapping under betrayal, because I had already discovered the other side of that breaking point: integration, wholeness, a kind of sovereignty that didn't need fanfare. And though life will always test me again, I know now that my empathy isn't a liability. It's a compass, sharp and steady, guiding me where I need to go. And so, we drift gently now toward the close of this long journey. The rhythm has slowed, the lights have softened, and the story that began with warnings and shadows now settles into a kind of stillness that no storm can easily disturb. What I have shared has been no grand triumph, no blazing conquest of life, but rather the quieter revelation that comes when one stops fighting themselves and starts listening deeply to what was always there beneath the noise. Empathy, once my cage, has become my compass. The shadow, once feared as a lurking monster, has turned into a companion who steadies my steps. Together they weave a balance that is less about perfection and more about acceptance. And in that acceptance lies a peace I wish I had known earlier, yet perhaps could only discover through the very detours that once felt like mistakes. Life rarely gives us shortcuts, but it does give us echoes that remind us where we faltered, where we grew, and where we might still find gentleness. As you rest tonight, let the thought linger that you are already whole, even in your scattered pieces. The broken places are not flaws to be hidden, but seams that show you have lived, have felt, have endured. Let the quiet settle around you like a blanket, and let the images fade into the background hum of the night. And now, with the faintest whisper, I will leave you here. Sleep deeply, dream kindly, and carry this calm with you into tomorrow.